Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel Markey. It's a pleasure having you. And we have a lot to discuss today: India, France, India, US, and the broader grand strategic picture of Indian foreign policy. Dr. Daniel Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. Previously, Dr. Markey was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council of Foreign Relations and a member of State Department's Policy Planning Commission staff. Thank you, Mr. Markey, for being on the show today.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Happy to join you.
Thank you, sir. So to begin with, let's start with the most recent trip of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to France. So PM Modi has been looking west lately. He was in Washington, D.C. late for a state visit. And just recently, he also attended the Bastille Day parade in France. What is your collective assessment on India's broader foreign policy, given Prime Minister Modi's recent trip to France and United States?
Well, Prime Minister Modi's done, I think, a good job in terms of cultivating ties with nearly every country in the world, with a couple of notable exceptions. We can talk about those later, but certainly in Europe and the United States, he has been very active, very energetic, and has effectively cultivated what seem to be very positive, friendly ties with the heads of state of those, at least in France and the United States. And I think he's doing it very much for political reasons, both in terms of his own domestic politics, for strategic reasons having to do with India's place in the world, and for some specific kind of security-related and to some extent economic-related reasons, where he sees that India has a lot to gain from closer ties with both France and the United States. And so he's pushing on all those fronts.
And can we talk about the deliverables from his recent France visit? There were agreements on very important defense issues, such as sending 26 Rafale jets tailored for naval purposes, and many more on semiconductor front as well. So can you talk a little bit about the deliverables from this particular visit of Prime Minister Modi to France?
Yeah, so France has actually been an important and increasingly important defense partner for India over the past, I'd say, 2 decades. In some ways, France has filled space that's increasingly being left by Russia open. Fighter jets that 20 years ago would almost definitely have been sold to India by the Russians now are something that the French are able to provide. This is an area actually where France and the United States have been to some extent in competition. The United States would have liked to be a provider of these jets and has tried repeatedly to put F-16s on offer and other variants that would be, at least from a US perspective, would be alternatives to the French. But the French have done a good job in this competition, and this trip was just another example of that. So it seems like they're moving forward with the jets. And I thought I saw something about a submarine deal and in a variety of other areas. What the French are good at least from an Indian perspective, is being willing to provide relatively cost-effective, high-end, high-tech, and high-quality equipment, and to share some of the intellectual property with India, to transfer some of that in ways that makes India more comfortable. And I would also say that India is comfortable with France as a strategic partner, in part because France has done less to criticize India at important points in Indian history. So, for instance, the French were less critical of India with its nuclear tests than was the United States. And so the French are in good stead with New Delhi. This was true before Narendra Modi, and it continues to be the case.
Indeed, very true. France is the second largest defense partner of India, and there has been agreements on, I think, 6 or 7 Scorpion class submarines as well. And of course, France has relatively maintained a low rhetoric on criticizing India on various fronts as compared to the United States. We would come to that point later as well. But I was wondering, why was France so inclined to host Prime Minister Modi at this particular juncture? Because is it something to do with the collective deterrence of the West in the Indo-Pacific against China, something that the US has also wanted India to act upon? So, what exactly is the inclination of France towards India like?
Look, I think the French do increasingly see China as a worrisome problem in the Indo-Pacific strategically. The French do have territorial holdings in the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. They are not quite the same kind of global power as the United States is, but they definitely see their national interests in that region and India as an important partner in defending those interests. So this isn't just about sort of helping India or seeing the world through an India-specific lens. This is actually serving French national security interests by having closer ties with an increasingly powerful India. Like the rest of the world, the French see India as a large and growing market, so there's an economic prospect there. In terms of the specific timing, I would say, it's political as well. Bastille Day is a big deal in France. Politicians like to show off that they have powerful friends around the world. Narendra Modi is a powerful friend, increasingly so. And so I think the French see it in those terms as well. But the French have also played a bit more of a balancing act internationally in terms of their rhetoric on China. So as I say, they are concerned about China's increasing power in the Indo-Pacific, but they also are eager not to completely align themselves with the United States in a highly competitive and increasingly critical stance on China. They sort of go back and forth on this. And in that respect, I think the French welcome India's independence on the international stage. And I think both sides have made something of this, the idea that they are, yes, friendly toward the United States, yes, in a sense, certainly France, a Western power, but that they can basically have their cake and eat it too. They can do multiple things at once. They can have different types of friends. And they can effectively maintain their strategic independence or autonomy in spite of the pressures and challenges that they face in the world. So there's a lot of alignment on all of those fronts.
You very rightly highlighted that France has sort of played a balancing act when it comes to China and sort of not has aligned to the United States rhetoric. It gives an impression that Europe, the bigger members of the EU and NATO, apart from the US, mostly like France and Germany, enjoy some amount of strategic autonomy when it comes to important issues such as China. So moving ahead with our core uh, uh, element here is the Prime Minister Modi's state visit to the United States. Before we get into the specific of this visit, the most fundamental question here is again about the timing of the visit. It comes at the moment when India has almost doubled its dependence on Russian energy, and it has come to at a point when India has not aligned with the United States when it comes to voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly, and also that India has refused to publicly condemn Russia for its war in Ukraine, although Prime Minister said in a very calming rhetoric. Again, there were so many observations regarding that this is not the era of war, and we should make some effort for negotiations and peace. So, what does exactly this say about India's potential as a catalyst in the great power competition? A catalyst every superpower, or I can say every pole, wants to have it on its side. So, exactly, the question is, what about the timing of this visit?
Well, I can pick that up in at least two different ways. One of them would be a kind of a narrowly political aspect to the timing. This visit takes place in basically the year before both Prime Minister Modi and President Biden will go back to try to win the next round of elections at the national level. And I think both leaders were very eager to show that over the past few years, since Biden has been in office, that they've made significant strides in their relationship, that they've done a lot. And they wanted to show that off. And they wanted to get some political credit for what they've done. And if you look at the calendar, this is really the only time that they could have such a meeting. Prime Minister Modi will be very busy hosting many heads of state with the G20 meeting in the fall, and presumably President Biden will be there for that.
Exactly, yeah.
So they couldn't wait too much longer. And so they wanted to sort of squeeze this big visit in and do it as a state visit, which is a big deal. I mean, that's really rolling out the red carpet for any foreign leader. And so, so both saw clearly domestic political advantages to that specific timing. Then there's the general timing, which I think you were getting at, the broader issue of the United States wanting to cultivate a closer relationship with India in this era of major power competition that the United States feels, certainly with respect to China, as well as with Russia. And here, yes, this is also a moment where I think the Biden administration sees things in a long-term time frame as well, and believes that India is the necessary kind of ballast or strategic counterweight to China in Asia, if only in part because India is enormous, and there's no other country like India that can really play that role. You do have important treaty allies in Japan and Australia and so on, but there's no other country that can rival China just in terms of scale. And I think the Biden administration has been pretty clear. They don't want to lose India in a sense, or miss an opportunity to build a really close relationship with India now, one that they perceive can last for the next decades. Politics will come and go, but India will not be going anywhere. And it will be essential to have that relationship if we have any hope of really competing against China over the long term. So that's the other aspect to the timing of this visit.
Very interesting. And the way you highlighted the long-term frame of looking at India as a strategic counterweight against China, we'll come to that later as well. And indeed, I think that's true that both leaders see it from the domestic elections point of view, considering the sizable population of Indian diaspora in the United States, and the bigger, I think, adds to the overall persona of Prime Minister Narendra Modi for his 2024 elections. So coming down to the deliverables and specifics of this state visit, one of the most important projects that came into play here was the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, the ISET, which was a wider agreement, including developing semiconductors in India, exchange of manufacturing jet engines in India, and artificial intelligence and whatnot. Could you lead on the specific for our viewers here? What is the importance of ISET here, and how is it different from the DTTI, which was signed in 2012?
Yeah, so there have been, as you point out, things like the DTTI and other efforts by the Indian and U.S. governments to, in a sense, get going partnership in a variety of high-tech commercial areas, as well as defense technologies, and to really jumpstart that part of the bilateral cooperation. And frankly, I think both sides have been a little bit frustrated with one another. They tell different stories about that frustration. I mean, I think the U.S. side has in the past sometimes complained that India or the Indian government or Indian governmental or private sector entities were eager to cooperate in ways that were really well beyond the kind of technological reach of the Indian state at the moment. They wanted to kind of go in for the high-end stuff, and they weren't willing to kind of work their way incrementally through a process that would be more familiar to the United States, and having partnered with many other countries and even allies on these types of things in the past. From the Indian perspective, there was a common refrain that, you know, the United States had a big bureaucracy, a lot of legal and to some extent technical barriers to entry for Indian companies, for Indian partners on all of these fronts, and that the United States really wasn't all that willing to actually let go of the kinds of technology that would make this cooperation worthwhile, and certainly not to do it at a price point that would be competitive with other partners. And so even though there's been a kind of a senior level desire to make this cooperation work, it just hasn't really borne fruit. And so what you see now with ISET is an effort, once again, but this time really stemming out of the offices of the national security advisors on both sides. So that's basically about as senior as you can get, right next to the president, or the prime minister, really some of the people they trust the most, pushing this forward. They started with a major meeting in Washington back in January. Now they've launched this initiative, and they've suggested that there are a few areas where they want to push forward. And you mentioned jet engine technology, the idea that GE would co-manufacture really super high-end stuff for the fighter jets, the I think 414 engine, something that the United States has been basically unwilling or unable to share with just about anybody else. Be willing to try to go forward with that with India. Now, the question here too, yet again, will be you have a really clear push at the senior levels. You have a degree of commercial and I believe military interest on both sides. But can they push it through? Can they actually get the deal done? This visit did not prove that. It just proved a willingness to try, and we'll see where that goes over the next couple of years.
You have sort of preempted my next follow-up question, which was about bonding the fruit of these agreements. So India clearly has expressed its demand for high-end stuff from the United States, including GE working with HAL in India and establishing and manufacturing jet engines. So the question is also about India providing that favorable environment. So what do you think, according to your assessment, does India's private sector or India's state manufacturing sector, do they have that kind of conducive environment to produce such high-end technology? And I would also like to cite an example of Foxconn, a Taiwanese telecommunication chip making company. They pulled out with an agreement with an Indian conglomerate called Vedanta Group, which were scheduled to make chip making again, semiconductors. So exactly, so an assessment on India's conducive environment for manufacturing such high-end technology.
It's a kind of a work in progress. This doesn't happen quickly, and I say that especially for things like chip manufacturing, which, although I'm not a technologist, I don't know the details, but in conversations that I've listened in on, it's very clear that there's a kind of an ecosystem that's necessary to make such manufacturing profitable and to enable it in any environment. And it's everything from the availability of guaranteed power supply, water, space, simply land availability, and the individuals, the personnel who are trained at a high enough level to keep the process going. And it usually works best if you're doing it, that is chip manufacturing, in an environment where you have other chip manufacturing plants, even competitor plants, not bad things necessarily. This is one of those technological ecosystems where competitors can feed on the available labor pool that they have. So they're similarly trained, they can be educated in ways that would make them, again, more competitive going forward. Now, India has parts of that, but not all of that. And so the Foxconn example is a kind of a bit of a worry, raises a question mark about, did they find that they were trying to make such deals? And from what I've read, it wasn't so much these broad structural issues, it's simply that they felt like the regulatory environment was not all that conducive to what they were trying to do, and they hit a few obstacles. It may also have been simply the timing. Foxconn may find that market conditions are not all that conducive to taking this particular bet. I saw that Foxconn also pulled out of a deal in the United States too. So you can make chips in the United States. It's not always the easiest thing. Taiwan has shown itself to be a great place to make them. And so the question will be, whether India can sort of pull itself together to take advantage of these things. Again, I guess I would say it also has to do with the specific area of technology. There are some things, and the jet engine story is one of them, where it's super specialized. And so you're not going to have quite the same issue as the chip manufacturing question, but where you really do need to see this as a kind of a long-term investment to build up to a point where you're really going to have the facilities. It's not like manufacturing in textiles or building out call centers or anything like that, where you can basically just plop one in the middle of a field, populate it with just about anybody who's nearby. No, this is a really specialized area. So, another example would be AUKUS, the AUKUS deal that the United States has done with Australia and the UK. And when we talk about enabling Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines, conventionally armed but nuclear-powered, we're not talking about them doing it in the next 3 years or 5 years, even 10 years. We're talking about decades of a process. So I think it's best to see this with India, even the jet manufacturing deal, as a matter of many years, not, this isn't going to bear fruit overnight.
All right, we shall give we should let time take its course, and I'm glad you brought up AUKUS and United States and UK investing in Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines, which brings me, and I think that sort of complements the broader strategic objectives of creating a deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. And coming to the strategic counterweight against China, the thing that you raised earlier. So I think it does make a lot of sense there, looking at India from United States perspective, because India is a member of Quad. India has mill-to-mill collaboration with the United States. It hosts its annual Yuddhabhyas exercises. But however, India has a history of non-alignment. India's history of not contributing troops or not engaging in kinetic activity outside the framework of United Nations sort of puts a question, and a question that has also been picked up in the United States from none other than Ashley Tellis, the architect of civil US-India civil nuclear partnership. So Washington's bad bet on New Delhi, how bad is it or how good is it? If you could lay down that for us, it would be amazing.
Sure. I mean, look, I've known Ashley for a long time. I think it's never smart to bet against Ashley and his judgment. I think that he has made actually a very specific, focused argument here. To some extent has been missed in some of the wider public debate about his article. But his specific argument is really geared toward parts of the US policymaking crowd, who I think have, in his estimate, and in my own, I would agree with him, have gone too far in anticipating the speed with which India will provide solutions to US military problems in Asia. And they believe that, some of them, that India, effectively, they don't know a great deal about India, but they see a big country willing to work with us, and they see a country that is threatened by China on its border, and they want to speed the process up radically to get India to a point that it'll effectively be a big Japan. And with a big Japan, you could expect that it would be aligned with the United States, even allied with the United States, on any critical security issue going forward, and would provide the United States with both basing and military cooperation at a very high level, and would bring a capability of its own to any future fight, including, say, a fight over Taiwan. And Ashley's correct kind of rejoinder to that is, no, you need to understand that India is interested in has its own concerns with respect to China. India can be helpful, but not at the maximal level or at the pace with which you are expecting it to become useful to the United States. So slow it down. And I think his ultimate argument is not to walk away from India, to the contrary, to sort of right-size our expectations for India, certainly in the near term, and preserve the maybe longer-term possibility that we'll gradually make our way closer to what people are suggesting, but maybe we won't. And even if we don't, it might still be useful to work with India. So, that's the kind of middle ground that he's trying to chart. And it's really a reflection of how quickly and enthusiastically India has been embraced here in certain crowds within, say, the Pentagon or other parts of the US government. And he wants to kind of urge greater caution there.
Exactly. The pace of this friendship getting closer and closer between both the leaders. And not to forget that it was President Biden's election campaign when he highlighted India's democracy index issues and the downslide of democratic, how can I put it, the democratic representation in the country. So that brings me to the second debate, something, Dr. Markey, that you have also touched upon previously in your Foreign Affairs article about the interest versus value-based relationship between both the countries. So this is the another debate, and this is that in United Washington is having interest-based dependence and relationship with India, but not a value-based. So if you could codify further, like what is this interest versus value-based partnership about? Value being India being a liberal democracy, but however downsliding in its index, and the trajectory of the human rights record, which is completely going down, and the interest being having a potential partner in Indo-Pacific against China. So
Yeah,
yes.
so happy to. So in my article, which actually interestingly is in a way complements Ashley's article. The two are not really touching exactly the same issues, but they're similar. In a sense, they're both about right-sizing expectations for India. But I'm more focused on the question of where does democracy or shared values fit into that equation? And so I try to make a couple of different arguments. I mean, one of them is that if you look at the US-India relationship over a longer term, over the stretch of its history, what I've found is that shared democracy, to the extent that we both had democracies, and always flawed democracies, there's never been a perfect democracy, but hasn't been a very good guide to alignment in the US-India worldview. So we've had democracies since India's independence, and yet we've disagreed on some of the major issues of the day throughout the entire Cold War, and even still, because Russia would be an example of where we really haven't seen eye to eye, or Myanmar, or Iran, and there are others. So democracy writ large maybe has kept us from being an adversary of India. The democratic peace theory, and for those of your viewers who are familiar with that, points out that that democracies don't tend to go to war with one another, and we haven't gone to war with India, so that holds. But it doesn't really suggest that we're going to naturally see the world the same way, and we haven't. In addition, however, as you pointed out, if India's democracy is eroding and India is becoming less democratic and more autocratic, if more majoritarian, more populist, if the rights of individuals are being less respected, if the media is less free, if the votes are less free, then that gives us even less reason to anticipate that our worldviews will be aligned. And so what I get from all of this is, why don't we just look at the narrow or narrower or more focused ways in which our interests align? And here it's actually impressive the way in which we actually have a lot of ground that we could cover if we just look at shared interests. Economic interests in terms of trade and investment are real. India is a big and important market. And our concerns about China, though not identical and really not stemming from the same worldview at all, are also important. And so if you just focus on the areas of interest which are in common, we still have a lot to do in terms of work in building a closer partnership. So I would argue that we should focus on that, and not so much all this talk about shared values or democratic principles, because that seems to be less and less true. And we should get to work on that kind of narrowed partnership. One last point, though, that narrowed partnership, here too, we talk about right sizing, it will have limits, because an India that would be more democratic, more aligned and more liberal in terms of its expectations for the world and world order, is one in which I think over the long term we'll have more in common with strategically. We'll want to accomplish the same things in the world. That's the kind of India that I think we should be sharing super high-end technology with, that we should see as a trusted partner for intelligence sharing and so on. And that's the kind of India that I'd really wish that we could invest in. But I'm afraid that that's not the India that we actually have at the moment. And so those super high-end areas of cooperation, I think should, at least for the time, we should temper our expectations for India, and we should temper our offers to India in those areas, even as we pursue that narrower cooperation, full speed ahead.
In a way, you were also mentioning that the democratic backsliding of India and the difference being larger and larger day by day in the value equation between United States and India should not sort of have a reflection in its strategic partnership.
Well, it should be reflected in terms of certain things are less on the table. I mentioned earlier AUKUS. AUKUS is an arrangement with the UK and Australia that the United States feels comfortable with, even though it's also very high-end technology, in part because it has this expectation that 2 decades from now, when the deal is finally done, Australia and the UK will still be fellow liberal democracies. Now, we could be wrong, but they've been fellow liberal democracies for long enough that it seems like a reasonable bet. The concern with India is an AUKUS type deal. I would say even possibly the GE jet engine type deal is something that should lead us to expect that 2 decades from now, we will see more or less eye to eye with India, with New Delhi. And I'm not sure that we will. And so I think that should raise some questions. That should focus our attention on some more specific issues like defending India's border from Chinese encroachment. That's an area where we have similar concerns with India today, where we could be doing more to provide intelligence and capabilities to make India's life easier today. That I fully support. It's some of these longer term expectations for India where I'm less comfortable with right now. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope our relationship improves and matures in ways that make us more comfortable working with India. But for the moment, I'm worried about India's political trajectory. And that makes me more inclined to narrow the areas of our cooperation and leave certain things out for now.
I'm glad there is no blind dependence on this kind of relationship, but sort of a very measured dependence which is required. And I think most foreign policy voices from India and like-minded foreign policy voices in the United States would concur with your assessment as well, that we should hold on and reassess our reach out to India. That brings me to the final question about Russia here. And because India and Russia both being have had the history of relationship which they continue to have, and they have expanded on that over the last 2 years. And both countries enjoy some amount of strategic autonomy. We have seen President Putin going about his limitless friendship with China, and at the same time, India is sort of making its very welcoming gesture towards the West, France and the United States particularly. So I am very interested to see that how would President Putin would see India warming up with the West, particularly with the United States, as India reaches close to a 200 billion trade mark with the US, making US India's largest trading partner.
Well, I think, let's put ourselves into Putin's shoes. Difficult to do, but if we try, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Putin is primarily worried about this adventure in Ukraine, which so far has not been going very well, and which is clearly and closely tied to his frustrations with, his animosity toward the West, and especially toward the United States. So in terms of his worldview, he seems obsessed with the question of Ukraine, the question of Russia's greatness on the international stage, and with what he believes to be the unrelenting hostility of the United States and its Western partners. That's really the beginning point for the way that he sees the world. That's everything else flows from there. So given that, his relationship with China is not so much built in and of itself out of a kind of a driving affection for or affiliation with Beijing, but is a kind of a consequence of his poor relationship with the West. He needs China, and he has seen China as a necessary partner because of his basically war with the West. And he sees China as more or less open to the relationship and to a world that he's comfortable with. That is a kind of a world that is safe for autocrats. So where does India fit into that?
Does that mean that the relationship with between Russia and China is more circumstantial in nature?
Yeah, I think that it is. But I think that it has evolved as those circumstances have changed. And I think that Russia is now increasingly vulnerable to or dependent upon China in ways that, if I were Putin, I would be uncomfortable with. And it's mainly because Russia has too few alternatives. Now, to see from Russia's perspective, to see India is not a solution to any of these problems for Russia. India, too, is a kind of a player, an important one that Russia would not like to lose to anyone else. And I'm sure that Putin is pleased that, even if India has kind of played a bit of a rhetorical hedging game on the war in Ukraine, India has not stopped buying oil from Russia. India has not broken with Russia. India has not criticized Russia very publicly or in ways that make Putin look bad. India has continued to include Russia in terms of its most of its international diplomacy. And I think Russia wants to keep that going. I think Russia would also like to keep India to believe that perhaps it can drive a wedge between Russia and China and not see the two of them come too close together. But ultimately, I don't believe that India has a real leverage in that relationship, because as I say, it's driven by the animosity, Russia's animosity with the West. That's the principal driver here. India can't solve that problem. For India, the best outcome, of course, and for many countries in the world, the best outcome for all of this would be that somehow Russia find its way back to the pre-invasion of Ukraine reality and go back to that game, because that was one in which they didn't have to pay such a big price for their closer ties with Russia. And they didn't have to worry quite as much about Russia-China ties becoming really tight. But we don't see that yet.
The final concluding question would be about India's pivot from Russia towards the West, diversifying India's defense needs by incorporating high-end, cutting-edge, expensive technology from the United States and France. So what is your collective assessment of India's pivot away from Russia, diversifying its technical needs in context of its adversaries, China and Pakistan?
So this is something that India was to some extent trying to do before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was trying to diversify supply. It recognized that Russia was, in a sense, a declining power, but not declining overnight, declining gradually, and could still provide cost-effective, capable military hardware, especially in certain areas like air defense, S-400. Air defense was something that India continued to see as actually quite high quality and very useful with respect to especially China, but also Pakistan. And so wanted to maintain a continued relationship with Russia, but gradually bring in other partners, especially France, but also Israel and certain niche technologies, and the United States and other Western countries as opportunities availed. So US in terms of heavy lift, or P-8 surveillance, or drone technology, or whatever. So India would like, I think, ideally to have gradually diversified so that it would be less vulnerable to any particular military supplier. The war in Ukraine has basically accelerated that process, puts more pressure on India to diversify more rapidly, and I think has raised some real alarm bells in terms of India's ability to meet near-term defense needs along the border with China. And so that's where India is sort of speeding up the process. Some of these purchases from from France, and even from the United States, the drones, the Reaper drones are something that the United States can provide that have immediate effect along that border. And so these are the kinds of things that India has to do. Now, the problem, as you alluded to, is one of cost. I mean, we just don't provide equipment at the same price point as the Russians. And so India will have to continue to look for ways either to convince us to somehow give it better sweetheart deals, which will become more cost effective, say, over time, or continue to hunt around for opportunities for indigenizing the technology so that India can build it itself. Of course, that's India's ultimate aim anyway. And look for other partners, again, a mix, maybe the Swedes, the French, and others to sort of fill the gaps, maybe even others who provide kind of knockoff former Soviet or Russian-made type equipment, but done elsewhere. Eventually maybe Ukraine will get back into that business, but not for now. And there may be others that can play that game too. So, India's got a bit of a problem. And, last point would simply be one of the areas which is hardest for India is its nuclear submarine program, which is built on the backbone of Russian technology and cannot be replaced overnight with French, with American, or with any other technology. That will take time. So we're talking about a decades-long process, but one which ideally India would have done within the next decade. And so that's going to create a kind of a gap between India's needs and its capabilities that will be worrisome for New Delhi, and they'll have to manage more politically than purely militarily.
Interesting how these agreements will be so slow-paced and will be taking so much time to finally materialize and show some reflection in the physical world. Well, Dr. Markey, thank you so much for your time. I hope our viewers get a lot to take away from this discussion. Thank you so much.